This video covers chapter 5.2 of the book Spring Boot Quick Start. This chapter describes how to serialize DTO into JSON, how to convert DTO Java object into JSON string. To serialize DTO into JSON string, endpoint should have DTO as its return value, and controller should be annotated either with the REST controller or annotation or with the controller annotation, in which case endpoint should be also annotated with response body annotation. This is because controller annotation by default returns web pages from the endpoint, and in order to tell Spring that value should be returned as is instead of looking for a web page, such endpoints need to be annotated with response body. In REST controller, by default, all endpoints return data instead of web pages, and therefore in the REST controller there is no need for additional endpoint annotation with response body. When serializing DTO into JSON, we can use JSON property and JSON format annotation, which are the same that we have been using during this serialization. The JSON property annotation is used to specify mapping between JSON properties and DTO properties and setter in case properties and getters in case their names differ. And the JSON format is used to specify in the examples that follow date format of JSON property, so that Spring Framework could properly populate this JSON property from a local date DTO property. To serialize DTO object into JSON string, Jackson can use either getters, which have priority, or if there are no getters, it will then use properties and read directly from the properties in order to generate a JSON string. So first we will show how to serialize DTO into JSON string by using DTO properties. So here is our DTO, person DTO, with following properties, and we want to serialize this DTO into this JSON string. So this is our controller, so our controller needs to be annotated with REST controller annotation, and our endpoint needs to have person DTO as its return value. Then inside the controller we can use person DTO, create an instance of a person DTO. Then by simply returning that instance, Spring Framework will automatically convert DTO properties into JSON string, and then such string will be returned from the controller back to the client, in our case a Chrome web browser. So this application can be tested by opening Chrome web browser and entering this URL. And in return, we will get a JSON string, also shown here. So this JSON string was created by person DTO instance that was created inside the controller, and then this instance, when returned from the endpoint, is automatically converted into a JSON string. Spring Framework will use the names of DTO properties as JSON properties when generating this string. We will now show how to serialize DTO into JSON string by using getters. In that case, our DTO beside properties, will also have these getters, and Spring Framework will use these getters to read DTO properties in order to get value from these properties, so that it will be able to generate JSON string. So Spring Framework will use the names of the getters to define the names of the JSON properties. Our controller, shown here, needs to be annotated with REST controller annotation, and our endpoint needs to return %DTO. So inside the endpoint, we are creating a %DTO, and then this instance is returned from the endpoint, during which phase a Spring Framework will then automatically convert this DTO by using these getters in order to generate this JSON string. And just to confirm that Spring Framework is really using getters, we have added this getter suffix so that we know that the value of the name was actually generated by this line rather than being read directly from the property. So our application can be tested by using Google Chrome to call this endpoint, and our endpoint will then return a JSON string, also shown here. Now we will show how to use JSON property annotation, which can be used to annotate DTO properties or DTO getters. And these annotations are used when names of the properties or names of the getters are different than the names that we want to use in a generated JSON string. So here we have so in this example, we will show how to use JSON property annotation to annotate properties, to tell Spring Framework which names to use for JSON property. So our DTO properties has following names, and without JSON property annotation, those names would have been used as names for a JSON properties. But instead, we want our properties in the JSON string to have these different names. So we can use JSON property annotation to specify which names to use when generating JSON string. So this line is saying that value of DTO property ID should be stored in a JSON property called ID with all capital letters, shown here. And this line is saying that the value from a DTO property name should be stored in a JSON property called person_name, as shown here. And the same applies for this last age property, where we want our JSON property to be also called age, but with a capital A. And here is our controller. It needs to be annotated with REST controller annotation, and endpoint needs to return %DTO. Then inside the endpoint, we are creating an instance of a %DTO, and then the endpoint is simply returning that instance. When the endpoint returns an instance of a DTO, this conversion will automatically take place, and Spring Framework will use the values from DTO properties to construct JSON string, and it will use JSON property annotation to specify the names of JSON properties. This application can be tested by using Chrome web browser and calling the endpoint's URL, and then the endpoint will return this JSON string, also shown here. We will now show how to use JSON property annotation to annotate DTO getters. So again, these are the names of the DTO getters, and without JSON property annotation, generated JSON string would have properties with these names. But we want our JSON string to have properties with different names. So for instance, we don't want our JSON property to be called ID. Instead, we want to be called ID with all capital letters. So we can use JSON property annotation to tell that to the Spring. So framework. So this line tells Spring Framework that when generating JSON string from this getter, the name of the JSON property should be ID with capital letters. And this line is telling Spring Framework that the value from this getter should be inside the JSON string. When constructing JSON string, the property should be called person name as shown here. This is how our controller looks like. It should be annotated with REST controller annotation, and endpoint should return person DTO. Inside the endpoint, we are creating a person DTO instance, and then we are returning that instance back. When the instance is being returned, Spring Framework will automatically convert DTO properties by using these DTO getters in order to construct JSON string that is being returned. And instead of using getter names to create names for JSON properties, it will use JSON property annotation to define how to name JSON properties. We will now show how to use JSON format annotation, which can be used to annotate both properties or getters, and this annotation is used to specify the format of JSON property value, and in both cases we will be working with date format. So here is our DTO with two properties, and this first property is being annotated with JSON format annotation, specifying in which format we want our date to be written when JSON string is being generated. So this is our generated birthday property in a JSON string, and with this JSON format annotation, we are telling Spring Framework that when it generates JSON value for this JSON property, it should be in this format. So first we will have day, then month, and then the year. This is how our controller would look like. It will be annotated with REST controller annotation, and endpoint should return person DTO. Inside the endpoint, we are creating an instance of person DTO, and we are using current date as a value for the birthday DTO property. And then we are simply returning this generated DTO instance back from the endpoint. At that point, Spring Framework will convert DTO properties, will use DTO properties to generate JSON string that is being returned, and the DTO property of type local date will be written in a JSON property in the format specified here, which results in a date that looks like this. Our application can be tested using Chrome web browser by calling endpoint URL, and endpoint will return this JSON string, which is also shown here. We will now show how to use JSON format annotations to annotate getters. So these two lines specify that when JSON string is being generated, then the value that is taken from this getter should be formatted in this way. So this getter is returning local date that represents a current date as shown here. And then with this JSON format annotation, we are telling Spring Framework in which format we want this date to be stored in a JSON property birthday. So this format is saying that we want to have days, months, and year. And this is then how a return date property, birthday date property would look like. This is our controller. Controller needs to be annotated with REST controller, and the endpoint needs to return person DTO. Inside the controller, we are creating DTO instance, and birthday is being defined as a current date. When this instance is returned from the endpoint, Spring Framework will automatically convert DTO properties into JSON string by using these getters. And this getBirthday getter has this JSON format annotation which defines in which format to write a JSON property birthday by using the return birthday local date value.